At 12:01 in the morning on August 19th, 2026, a 50% tariff is set to hit nearly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods entering the United States. Dairy, alcohol, furniture, clothing, toys, even hockey sticks and cement. Unless something changes in Washington in the next few days, the clock runs out and neither side has blinked yet. This is not a hypothetical. It is not a rumor from an anonymous social media account. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, 3 separate proclamations signed by President Donald Trump on July the 20th, 2026, under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, are already law, waiting for their effective date. And according to Reuters reporting out of Ottawa on August 13th, a source directly familiar with the negotiations says both the Canadian and American sides now want a deal struck before that deadline arrives. So the real question isn't whether tension exists. It's whether two governments that have spent 18 months circling each other can find a way to step back from the edge, or whether Canada is finally prepared to do what it has threatened for months and simply walk away from the table. Before we go further, it's worth being precise about what has actually happened and what hasn't. Canada has not formally ended trade talks with the United States. As of this week, negotiators are still meeting in Washington, and both governments are, by their own public statements, still trying to land an agreement. What has happened is something more specific, and in some ways, more consequential. Canada's own chief trade negotiator has told her American counterpart, in direct terms, that if these 50% tariffs go into effect as planned, it would represent what one senior source described as a cliff, a point past which the talks themselves might not survive. That's not spin. That's not a headline writer's flourish. That's the language being used inside the negotiating room, according to reporting from the Globe and Mail this week. So the walking away isn't finished. But the possibility of it, the seriousness with which Ottawa is now treating that possibility, is real. And it's new. To understand how two close allies, two countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth, got to a point where their own negotiators are using words like cliff, you have to go back to where this all started. The current chapter of the Canada-U.S. trade war traces back to February 1st, 2025, when the first Trump administration tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods took effect. At the time, Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister, and Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs of its own, hitting American goods dollar for dollar in some categories. Trump, for his part, framed the tariffs as necessary to shrink the trade deficit, to force tighter security on the shared border against fentanyl trafficking, and to push manufacturing back onto American soil. Canada called the tariffs unjustified and argued they violated the terms of the existing continental trade agreement known as CUSMA, or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Then in March 2025, everything shifted politically inside Canada. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, took over as Prime Minister and almost immediately called a snap election. That election, held in the shadow of an escalating trade war, became a referendum on who could stand up to Trump. Carney ran on a message that the era of close, easy relations between Washington and Ottawa was, in his words, over, that the United States could no longer be counted on as a reliable partner. He used the phrase elbows up, a hockey term borrowed to signal that Canada would play the trade fight physically, not passively. He won. And from that point on, Carney's entire political identity has been tied to how he handles Trump. It hasn't been a straight line. In June 2025, Canada withdrew its digital services tax, a policy that would have taxed large American technology companies operating in Canada, specifically to get stalled trade talks moving again. Some analysts, including Brock University political science professor Blaine Haggart, later argued that concession achieved, in his words, less than nothing, that Canada gave up leverage and got little in return. That criticism has followed Carney through much of 2025 and into 2026. This idea that his approach of appeasement followed by toughening has cost Canada a negotiating room rather than building it. Then came October 2025 when the talks broke down entirely, not over tariffs directly, but over an advertisement. The province of Ontario ran a commercial quoting former President Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs, using archival audio to make the case that protectionism historically hurts the country imposing it. Trump was furious, calling the ad misleading, and he halted trade negotiations outright. For weeks, the two sides didn't talk. It wasn't until the FIFA World Cup draw event, where Carney, Trump, and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum were seated together, that the ice began to thaw. Trump and Carney held a closed-door meeting afterward. The Prime Minister's office said both sides agreed to keep working on CUSMA. But the damage from that pause lingered, and it set the tone for how fragile this relationship has remained ever since. Through the winter, things escalated on a different front entirely. In January 2026, during a visit to China, Carney announced Canada would lower its steep tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%, with an initial annual cap of 49,000 vehicles, growing to roughly 70,000 over 5 years. In exchange, China agreed to lower its own tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood, all of which Beijing had targeted after Canada matched Washington's earlier EV tariffs. Trump had explicitly threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian exports if Ottawa struck any free trade deal with China. Carney, for his part, was careful to draw a distinction. According to the Associated Press, he stated clearly that Canada had no intention of pursuing a full free trade agreement with China, and that any changes to tariff structure would respect Canada's existing obligations under CUSMA and would involve notifying both the United States and Mexico. It was a narrow, calculated move, enough to ease pressure from Beijing without triggering the full wrath of Washington. Whether it fully succeeded is still being debated. By the middle of 2026, the tariff structure Canada was operating under had become genuinely complicated, layered with multiple separate legal actions stacked on top of each other. Steel, aluminum, and copper were already facing 50% tariffs under Section 232 of U.S. trade law, a national security provision. Then, on July 24, 2026, a new 10% tariff kicked in under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, tied to a U.S. Trade Representative investigation that found Canada, along with dozens of other countries, had failed to adequately enforce prohibitions on goods made with forced labor. Products that were fully compliant with CUSMA were exempted from that particular tariff, which offered Canadian exporters at least some relief. But the bigger shock came less than a week later. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed those 3 new proclamations under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision, according to law firm Wiley's Public Trade Alert, that had never once been used by any American president before this. Section 338 allows a president to impose duties of up to 50% on goods from a country found to be discriminating against U.S. commerce. In Canada's case, the administration pointed to 3 specific grievances: a 25% Canadian tariff on American-made vehicles, provincial-level restrictions that had effectively frozen American alcohol sales in parts of Canada, and a dairy quota system that Washington argued gave preferential market access to the European Union over the United States. According to the law firm Fasken, which has been tracking the tariff timeline closely for Canadian businesses, these new 50% duties apply regardless of whether the underlying goods would otherwise qualify for duty-free treatment under CUSMA, and they cover an enormous range of products. Everything from electronics and telecom equipment to furniture, building materials like lumber and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear, toys, cosmetics, and agricultural goods like flowers and plants. Energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals were specifically excluded, along with goods already covered by separate tariff actions. In total, the U.S. Trade Representative estimates the measures touch close to $20 billion in annual Canadian imports. That is the number hanging over everything right now. $20 billion, 5% of Canada's total exports to the United States, according to CBC News, set to face a 50% surcharge starting August 19th, unless negotiators can find common ground before then. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this stacking of tariffs actually is, because it didn't happen all at once. Canadian businesses spent the first half of 2026 absorbing one increase after another, each justified under a different piece of U.S. trade law. Steel and aluminum tariffs, which had sat at 25% for years under Section 232 national security provisions, were effectively doubled in the summer of 2026, pushing them to 50%, a move that hit Canadian producers especially hard since Canada has long been the single largest foreign supplier of both steel and aluminum to the American market. Then came the forced labor tariff under Section 301 in late July, layered on top. Then, within days, the Section 338 proclamations covering dairy, alcohol, and that long list of consumer and industrial goods. 4 separate legal justifications, 4 separate tariff actions, all converging on Canadian exporters within roughly the same 6-week window. From the perspective of Canadian manufacturers and exporters, it hasn't felt like one trade dispute. It's felt like several overlapping ones arriving at once, each requiring its own response, its own legal reading, its own lobbying effort in Washington. That layering also explains why Carney has repeatedly insisted he isn't interested in a narrow deal that addresses only one piece of this puzzle. If Canada secured relief on the Section 338 tariffs covering dairy and alcohol, for instance, but left the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs untouched, entire regions of the country, particularly Quebec, where aluminum production is concentrated, and Ontario and Hamilton, where steelmaking is centered, would still be facing enormous cost pressure. That's part of why Carney chose to make his firmest public comments about the negotiations from inside an aluminum plant in Saguenay, standing in front of the workers most directly exposed to the steel and aluminum tariffs, rather than from Ottawa. It was a deliberate choice of backdrop, tying his negotiating posture directly to the industry and the workers who would be hurt most by a bad outcome. So what does the negotiating room actually look like this week? According to CBC News, reporting from August 5th, Prime Minister Carney said Canadian negotiators were focusing talks on what he called all strategic sectors, including autos, as the deadline approached. He said he remained very involved personally in the discussions his team was having in Washington. Dominic LeBlanc, the federal minister responsible for Canada-U.S. relations, has been shuttling back and forth to Washington repeatedly. On August 12th, according to reporting compiled from multiple outlets including Reuters, LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, met again with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, their third meeting in as many weeks. LeBlanc wrote afterward that Canada remained committed at the negotiating table and would continue to, in his words, staunchly defend Canadian interests. Reporting from Bloomberg and BNN Bloomberg indicated that trade representatives from both countries were aiming to present Trump with a framework for a deal before the deadline hits. What's actually on the table? According to reporting compiled by the outlet Quartz, drawing on Reuters sourcing, the items under discussion include eliminating Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on American-made autos, lifting the provincial restrictions on American alcohol sales that had frustrated Washington, and reworking the structure of Canada's dairy quota system. Those three issues map almost exactly onto the three specific grievances the Trump administration cited when it announced the Section 338 tariffs in the first place, which suggests both sides know precisely what would need to move for a deal to happen. But movement hasn't been easy. According to a report from the cattle site, drawing on CBC sourcing, the American side offered a new proposal on Tuesday, August 11th, that would lower some of the threatened tariffs, but not by as much as Canadian negotiators wanted. And then there's the political temperature, which turned sharply in the first week of August. On Thursday, August 6th, President Trump gave a speech in Las Vegas in which he criticized Canada directly. According to the Washington Post and The Hill, Trump said, quote, "Canada's nasty, they are. They're nasty. I love the people, but they're nasty. Nasty leadership." Carney's response, delivered the same day in Saguenay, Quebec, after touring an aluminum facility, was notable for how directly he engaged with the word itself. Speaking partly in French, Carney said, "This is a tough negotiation. You can say nasty. But this is a question of Canadian jobs. It's a question of the future of Canadian businesses." According to The Hill's reporting, Carney actually laughed at Trump's comments about Canadian leadership before adding, "We are in the middle of a tariff war with the Americans." Behind those trade grievances sits a broader argument the Trump administration has been making publicly for months about the scale of the American trade deficit generally. According to CBC News reporting, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told a Senate Finance Committee hearing last month that the country's overall trade deficit, not limited to Canada, but across all of America's trading partners, had reached $1.2 trillion in 2025, a figure he described to the committee as a national emergency. That framing matters because it's the backdrop against which the administration has justified an unusually aggressive stretch of tariff actions this year, not just against Canada, but against a wide range of countries. Canada, however, occupies a specific place in that broader picture, given how tightly integrated its economy already is with the United States through decades of duty-free trade under CUSMA and its predecessor agreements. A dispute that might be a minor irritant with a smaller trading partner becomes, with Canada, a fight over supply chains that run directly through both countries multiple times before a finished product ever reaches a store shelf. Something automotive parts manufacturers on both sides of the border have pointed to repeatedly as a reason these tariffs cause pain quickly, rather than gradually. That same week, Carney made another statement that's worth sitting with because it tells you something about where Canada's red lines currently sit. Speaking to reporters and reported by the Globe and Mail on August 6th, Carney said he was, quote, "not interested in a narrow sector-by-sector trade deal that left Trump's major tariffs untouched elsewhere." He said, in English, "We're interested in a more comprehensive deal, more global deal." In French, he'd made clear the same point. Canada wasn't going to accept isolated fixes for individual industries while leaving the broader tariff structure in place. He specifically said any agreement needed to address autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products together, not piecemeal. There's also a smaller, less economic dispute that's been simmering alongside the tariff fight and adding friction to the relationship. According to recent reporting, the Trump administration said last week it would hold Canada accountable for wildfire smoke that drifted south from Canadian wildfires into more than a dozen American states. It's a strange thing to mention in the same breath as tariffs on dairy and cement, but it captures something real about the current mood between these two governments, that almost every point of contact, economic or otherwise, is being treated as leverage or grievance right now. So, where does the cliff warning fit into all of this? According to the Globe and Mail's reporting this week, Janice Charette, Canada's chief trade negotiator, told U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer directly that if Trump follows through on the 50% tariffs as scheduled, it would represent a cliff that could halt negotiations entirely. That's a specific, deliberate warning, delivered by the person actually sitting across the table from the Americans. It's not a campaign talking point. It's a negotiating signal, and a serious one. The Globe's own analysis framed it this way. Walking away from trade talks with the United States is far riskier for Canada than, say, keeping relations with China chilly for a few years, given how deeply intertwined the two economies are. But the piece also argued that there has to be some point at which choosing to walk away is a better option than continuing to make concessions every time a new threat is issued. Otherwise, in the analysis's words, Canada will keep on losing anyway. That tension between the real economic risk of a rupture and the political and strategic cost of endless concession is exactly what's playing out in Ottawa and Washington right now. And it's producing some sharply different reads on how well Carney is actually handling it. Part of what makes this moment different from earlier flashpoints in the trade war is the domestic political coalition Carney has managed to build around his negotiating posture. Last month, Carney met with Canada's provincial premiers in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, where, according to Bloomberg's reporting, he repeated the pledge that has become central to his public messaging, that Canada will not accept a bad deal. Getting provincial premiers, who don't always agree with each other or with the federal government on trade strategy, to stand behind a unified negotiating position has been one of the more notable features of how Carney has managed this file. Tom Mulcair's column specifically credited that premier-level unity as evidence that Carney's approach is working better than critics acknowledge, that keeping the provinces aligned gives Canada's negotiators more credibility at the table in Washington, because American counterparts can't easily exploit regional divisions the way they might have with a less coordinated federal-provincial relationship. Public opinion also appears to be reinforcing Carney's firmer posture rather than pushing back against it. According to polling referenced in Globe and Mail analysis this week, drawing on Angus Reid Institute data, a majority of Canadians do not want their government to give in to American demands, and most support Canada maintaining its own counter-tariffs, rather than dropping them unilaterally as a goodwill gesture. That same polling data reportedly shows Canadians have grown increasingly comfortable with measures like consumer travel boycotts aimed at the United States, a grassroots response to the trade war that has run in parallel with the official government-to-government negotiations. That public mood gives Carney some room to hold a firmer line without it necessarily eroding his political support at home, which is part of why, according to the Globe and Mail's own analysis, he doesn't have unlimited flexibility to make concessions, but he also doesn't face the kind of domestic pressure to fold quickly that a less popular leader might. On one side, you have critics like Professor Haggart, who argued in the Globe and Mail that nothing about Carney's approach, particularly his pursuit of what Carney himself calls a comprehensive trade and security agreement, makes what Haggart bluntly called a lick of sense. The BBC, in its own reporting, noted that some observers now openly question whether Carney can deliver the fair deal for Canada that he promised during last year's election campaign. Roland Paris, a former advisor to the Canadian government on U.S. relations, told the BBC it's too early to say definitively whether Canada has conceded things prematurely, but he was blunt about the stakes. If, in the end, Carney appears to have capitulated to Trump and Canada is left with a bad deal, Paris said, he will pay a political price at home. On the other side, you have commentators like Tom Mulcair, the former federal NDP leader turned political analyst, who argued in a CTV news column published August 13th that critics should, in his words, stop the hand-wringing, that Carney is actually outmaneuvering Trump by keeping Canada's provincial premiers unified and by maintaining a calm, strategic posture rather than reacting to every provocation. That's a genuinely different read on the exact same set of facts, which tells you how contested this moment is even among people who study Canadian politics for a living. What's notable is that Carney himself seems to be trying to hold both of these positions at once, projecting firmness publicly while keeping the door to a deal open. On August 5th, in comments reported by CTV News, Carney described Canada's tone toward the United States as, quote, already quite firm, while simultaneously insisting the negotiations themselves remained, quote, constructive. And in remarks reported by Bloomberg on August 13th, drawing on a pledge Carney has repeated many times over the past year, he said plainly, Canada will not accept a bad deal. That phrase has become something close to a personal mantra for him throughout this entire process, dating back to meetings with Canada's premiers. It's worth stepping back here and asking what a bad deal versus a good deal would actually look like from Canada's side, based on everything currently on the table. A good deal by the terms Canadian negotiators appear to be pushing for, would mean the 50% tariffs on dairy, alcohol, and that sprawling list of consumer and industrial goods simply don't take effect on August 19th in exchange for Canada easing its retaliatory tariffs on American autos, opening provincial alcohol markets further to American producers, and adjusting the dairy quota system in a way that satisfies Washington's complaints about EU preference. A bad deal from Carney's stated framework would be accepting a narrow sector-specific fix, say relief just on autos, while leaving steel, aluminum, and forest products exposed to ongoing tariff pressure. Based on his own comments, that outcome is one he has explicitly said Canada is not interested in accepting. There's also the matter of what happens legally, separate from whatever the two governments negotiate politically. According to the law firm Fasken's analysis, the use of Section 338 to justify these new 50% tariffs raises real legal questions, precisely because the provision has never been tested in modern trade practice. It's reasonable to expect that if these tariffs do take effect on August 19th, they could face challenges in American courts, independent of whatever diplomatic outcome unfolds. That's an important caveat, because it means even a worst-case scenario on August 19th, tariffs going into effect, talks stalling, wouldn't necessarily be the final word. There would likely be a legal track running in parallel to whatever happens politically. And then there's the broader question of what any of this means for the future of CUSMA itself, the underlying trade agreement that's supposed to govern duty-free trade across the continent. According to earlier reporting, Trump has at various points mused publicly about letting CUSMA lapse entirely when it comes up for a scheduled review, rather than renewing it. That review is looming over this entire negotiation. If Washington and Ottawa can't find common ground on individual sector disputes right now, in the weeks before a single tariff deadline, it raises harder questions about whether they'll be able to agree on renewing the entire architecture of North American trade when that larger review comes due. So, with all of that laid out, where does this actually stand as of this week? And what happens between now and August 19th? As of Thursday, August 13th, according to a Canadian government source cited by Reuters, talks were described as progressing well, and crucially, the source indicated the American side also wants a deal in place before the deadline hits, not just Canada. That's a meaningful detail, because it suggests Washington has its own reasons to avoid letting these tariffs actually take effect, whether that's concern about consumer prices, pressure from American industries that rely on Canadian steel and aluminum inputs, or simply a preference for claiming a negotiated win over an unresolved trade rupture with one of America's largest trading partners. At the same time, CBC's reporting from just a day earlier described Canada as unhappy with what the U.S. side has offered so far, suggesting the gap between the two positions, while narrowing, hasn't fully closed. That's the honest state of play. Not a done deal, not a collapsed negotiation, a genuinely live, moving situation with days rather than weeks left on the clock, real economic stakes running into the billions of dollars, and a negotiating team on the Canadian side that has explicitly signaled it's willing to walk away from the table rather than accept a deal it considers bad, while simultaneously working, according to every available report this week, to try to land an agreement before that becomes necessary. If the deadline passes without a deal, here's what would concretely happen, based on the terms of the proclamations themselves. At 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time on August 19th, the 50% tariffs would apply automatically to any covered goods entered for consumption in the United States from that point forward. Businesses on both sides of the border have reportedly already begun adjusting. The law firm Holland & Knight, in guidance published for affected companies, recommended reviewing supply contracts, reassessing Canadian sourcing arrangements, and even considering accelerating imports ahead of the deadline to beat the new tariff rate. That's not abstract policy analysis. That's real companies, on both sides of the border, making real operational decisions right now based on the possibility that this negotiation fails. If a deal is reached instead, based on everything currently reported to be on the table, it would likely involve Canada easing its retaliatory auto tariffs, some loosening of provincial alcohol restrictions, and a renegotiated dairy quota framework, in exchange for the U.S. either canceling or substantially narrowing the scope of the Section 338 tariffs before they take effect. Whether that satisfies Carney's stated demand for a comprehensive deal covering steel, aluminum, and forest products as well, rather than just the 3 specific sectors named in the proclamations, remains genuinely unclear based on current reporting. There's also a middle scenario worth naming honestly, because negotiations this complex rarely resolve in a single clean outcome. Washington and Ottawa could announce a partial framework right around the deadline, enough progress to justify a short technical extension of the August 19th date, without a fully finalized agreement on every sector. That's roughly what happened earlier in this same trade dispute, when an earlier tariff deadline was extended after Carney announced a domestic buy Canadian procurement policy and other targeted relief measures, according to the timeline compiled by the law firm Blake's. Deadlines in this particular trade relationship have moved before. It would not be unprecedented for August 19th to shift again, even by a matter of days, if both sides can show enough momentum to justify it publicly without either government looking like it folded. What would make this deadline different from earlier ones that got pushed back is the specific language now coming from Canada's own negotiating team. Extensions in the past came without anyone on the Canadian side publicly signaling a willingness to let talks collapse entirely. The cliff language from Charette is new, and according to the Globe and Mail's sourcing, it wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate message meant to be heard clearly on the American side of the table, at a moment when Washington is reportedly just as motivated as Ottawa to avoid the tariffs actually taking effect. There's one more piece of context that helps explain why this particular deadline carries so much weight, beyond the dollar figures involved. CUSMA itself is due for a formal joint review in 2026, a built-in checkpoint written into the agreement when it was renegotiated during Trump's first term. That review is supposed to determine whether the three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, continue the agreement for another extended period or begin unwinding it. Trump has, at various points over the past year, openly mused about letting the agreement lapse rather than renewing it, according to earlier reporting on his comments. Every one of the individual tariff fights happening right now, the Section 338 proclamations, the Section 232 steel and aluminum duties, the Section 301 forced labor measure, technically sits somewhat outside CUSMA's core framework, since they're each justified under separate legal authorities. But the cumulative effect of all of them happening at once, right as the broader agreement approaches its review window, makes it hard for either government to treat this month's deadline as an isolated event. If Washington and Ottawa can't manage a comprehensible sector-by-sector negotiation over dairy and autos this summer, that raises real questions about how the far more complicated full review of CUSMA will go once it formally begins. Several trade analysts cited across the reporting this week have made exactly that connection, treating the current standoff as an early signal of how the larger renewal fight might unfold. To be fully transparent about the sourcing behind everything you've just heard, the tariff details, dates, and legal provisions come directly from official U.S. trade representative announcements and from trade law analysis published by the firms Wiley, Fasken, and Holland and Knight. Statements from Prime Minister Carney and President Trump are drawn from reporting by CBC News, CTV News, the Globe and Mail, the Washington Post, The Hill, and Bloomberg. The specific warning about a negotiating cliff comes from the Globe and Mail's sourcing on Janice Charette's private comments to Jameson Greer, and it should be treated as reported, not officially confirmed by either government in public statements. Neither Ottawa nor Washington has put that exact framing on the record themselves. Similarly, the characterization of Carney's overall strategy as either successful or a capitulation is opinion and analysis from named commentators like Tom Mulcair, Blaine Haggart, and Roland Paris, not settled fact. And it's presented here as exactly that. Competing interpretations from people who watch this relationship closely, not a verdict. What isn't in dispute is the calendar. August 19th is real. The $20 billion in exposed goods is real, drawn straight from the U.S. Trade Representative's own estimate. The meetings in Washington this week between LeBlanc, Charette, and Greer happened, confirmed by multiple outlets including Reuters. And the underlying question the title of this story points to, whether Canada is actually prepared to walk away from Trump's trade plan rather than keep absorbing new tariff threats, has, for the first time in this 18-month standoff, been raised directly by Canada's own chief negotiator inside the room, rather than just implied by public rhetoric. Whether Carney ultimately lets that cliff become real or finds a landing before August 19th may end up defining his entire term as Prime Minister. He was elected specifically on the promise that he could stand up to Trump in a way his predecessor couldn't. If talks collapse and tariffs hit $20 billion in Canadian goods, he'll face pressure from industries and provinces absorbing that hit. If he strikes a deal that critics view as too narrow or too accommodating, he'll face exactly the capitulation charge that Roland Paris warned about. There may not be a version of the next week that doesn't carry real political risk for him, regardless of which direction the talks go. What do you think Carney should do if the Americans don't move enough before the 19th? Hold the line and let the tariffs hit, or take whatever deal is on the table to avoid the disruption? Let us know where you land on that. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep following this as it develops.